transportation that is critical. Then the whole issue of how do you treat water as a very specific scarce resource. And finally, what do you do about solid waste management? This, by the way, doesn't exhaust what I would call the sustainability issues. I mean, there are a whole lot of other issues, lifestyle issues, parks, biodiversity parks, food chain issues. I mean, that all would form part of a sustainable urbanization analysis, and they're not included here. So let me spend the rest of my time. I don't know how much, Ravi, how many minutes do you want me to speak now? Half an hour? 20? Something like that? Okay. So I will divide my time to address each of these issues. Now, in all of these issues, there are some common themes. Common theme number one is that you can't leave it to the market, because this is an area where there's lots of externalities. I mean, if the externality issue wasn't there, then the simplest thing would be that if you're not distorting prices, more or less, things will work out okay, except for the poor, you need to do something. Here you've got major externalities, so there has to be intervention. Otherwise, you won't get an optimum result. That's point number one. Point number two is that it's not one intervention. In each of these areas, if you want to move the system from A to B, the number of interventions is multiple. There's regulatory intervention, there's price-related intervention, subsidy, tax-related intervention, etc., etc. And one of the interesting things is that each of these instruments is controlled by different levels of government. So to get an optimal response to policy in each of these areas requires a coordination between different silos in the same government, and what is worse, coordination across levels of government, which is not at all easy. There's the issue of financial viability. Whatever set of policy instruments are proposed, and one of the key instruments here tends to be public investment, because a lot of that is necessary. It has to be fitted within a framework which is financially viable. And last, of course, a lot of what we propose may look unviable or too costly today, but technology change is going to provide the solution. And I think economists, because they're used to static economic analysis, tend to ignore technology. Most of what we do today would not have been possible 20 years ago because the technology was different. And we are underestimating generally what technology can achieve. This has implications for policy, that the framework of policy should not be locked so that we say this is how cars are built, and so we are going to continue driving the Morris Oxford simply by calling it the Ambassador for the next 50 years. You want a framework where if there's a new technology coming in, it's able to come in and make a difference. These are all preliminary remarks which are relevant to the way we look at these problems. So let's look at the first one. Energy, conserving fossil energy. I mean, I think the subtitle of the chapter says electricity use in buildings, but the text makes it clear that actually it's fossil-based electricity that we want to conserve. Now, clearly, this goes to the old issue that, you know, there are two ways of doing that. One is that you reduce energy use per activity, and the other is you reduce emissions per energy type. And if you multiply the two, you'll actually reduce emissions for all the different activities you're engaged in. And in the energy use in buildings, you've got really a combination of these things that are possible. First is, of course, the energy use in a building for purposes of heating, lighting, and cooling, depending on the climate. In our case, cooling is very important. Now here, it's quite clear that building design and building materials can make a huge difference. Right down to orientation of buildings, ventilation, use of materials, all of this can greatly reduce what would otherwise be the lighting load as well as the cooling heating load. So this is the first step, and this can only be handled really through regulatory intervention. We do make the point that, you know, we have codes, but they haven't been made mandatory yet. So the issue really is, should we, I'm now talking about a framework of 20 years, so we're not talking about day after tomorrow. How would one go about transiting to a system where the regulatory codes for buildings sort of move to something that would force people to comply? Now, linked to that, of course, is enforcement. I mean, you can have these codes, but you've got to have a system where buildings are made to comply, that there is a proper certification that takes place, and not a system in which buildings don't comply, they get built, and after a while somebody gets up and says, this building is non-compliant, let's break it down. Which typically, by the way, is what happens in an ill-designed regulatory framework. Well, one important thing in all of this is to make people aware that the redesigning of buildings, and you can do both retrofitting and new design, can make a difference. And actually both, I mean, the good thing about this whole thing is that there's virtually nothing here that isn't in use somewhere. The only point is it's not scaled up. So every example that I give, there'll be some successful application, and here the most successful application for retrofitting is Rashtrapati Bhavan itself, which was retrofitted and apparently has reduced its energy use by 30%. We're doing the same thing in the Planning Commission. We've asked them to do some retrofitting adjustments and see whether we can reduce our energy use by 30%. I think there's no reason why, as a government policy, government should not say that, number one, we are entering into a phased program of retrofitting every government building above a certain size. And secondly, that all new government buildings will meet certain green standards. Now, there are green standards. There's the international LEED standard. There's the domestic GRIHA standard, which Terry has developed. I don't particularly care which one we choose, but this is something that the central government could simply do. It would involve some startup costs. We know that over time, there would be a lot of saving in the electricity consumption. But I think if government were to sort of do that, then the next step would be state governments could do the same thing. If governments are not willing to take those bets, it's quite silly to expect anybody in the commercial sector to be convinced. Although, the interesting thing is, can I get a glass of water? The interesting thing is that in the private sector, voluntary compliance, which may be just due to enthusiasm or wanting to be out in front, has led to a very large number of what are internationally called platinum-rated buildings. Now, you know, numbers in a country like India don't deserve to be elevated too much. I'm not sure that as a percentage of buildings we are that high up, but it's important to note that in terms of numbers, we have quite a lot, and hopefully that will spread. So that's on the regulatory side. But you know, it's quite clear that the incentive for commercial people to get into this is not unconnected with what the electricity cost is. Now, if electricity is properly costed, there is a greater incentive to save. If electricity is undercharged, much below cost, then the incentive is correspondingly reduced. And I mean, this is a big issue across the country. That is electricity pricing correct? Now here you've got two sorts of problems. I mean, on the one hand, there is a very strong conviction that the lowest users of electricity should be highly subsidized. I personally don't mind that at all, as long as it's a cross-subsidy. So as long as somebody is saying, we want to subsidize people in this category, and the entire cost is going to be loaded onto the other, because I think the system will be self-balancing. And it is at the upper end that all these incentives for efficiency and building redesign and all the rest of it actually will work. Now, obviously, I wouldn't carry that too far, but I think as long as it's a cross-subsidy arrangement, richer people, commercial people, hospitals, doctors, those kinds of users of electricity who can actually afford it also, will in fact be incentivized to move towards building design that would save on electricity. But remember, the building design is being done at the municipal level and or state government level. The pricing of electricity is being done at the state electricity regulator level, and that pricing itself depends on the pricing of primary energy, which is more or less decided at the central government level. So unless all of this pulls together, you won't have that effect. Second important user of electricity, of course, is appliances. That's different from lighting and heating, although lighting is actually lighting in a way, the actual production of the light is an appliance. The need for light is a function of the building design. So if you include air conditioners, heaters, lights, computers, refrigerators, televisions, you name it, these are all things that use up quite a lot of electricity. And the issue is, how do you incentivize more energy efficiency? Here, I think experience shows, and the US experience in particular, that a bold regulatory enforcement of getting to higher efficiency standards triggers a lot of research on the part of companies, and they are actually able to reduce costs, which they wouldn't do if they were relying only on consumer feedback. So if the US had jacked up its electricity pricing, I doubt if the signal would have gone to the refrigerator industry to start saving on electricity. But because the US simply enforced an improvement in energy efficiency after much fuss and lobbying, the industry just got on and did it. So I think we have to learn lessons from that. And one of the great advantages that we have is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, the technology for reducing electricity is going to be there across the world because everybody faces the same problem. So an aggressive use of regulatory standards can actually make a big difference. You know, regulatory standards, of course, are effective if they're enforced, but they're hugely facilitated if the price system encourages it. So once again, if people are made aware of the fact that, you know, using incandescent bulb is going to use up a lot of electricity, whereas LED light doesn't, or fluorescent light doesn't, then I think people will in due course switch. But here again, big users, there are a lot of uncertainties on the part of consumers. I mean, you give them a new bulb and they say, oh, this is going to burn out within 5 hours or something. I'm not going to spend that much money. So I think, again, both the government and the big commercial guys have a huge responsibility in demonstrating that the technology works. I mean, in one case, you know, where we switched from the ordinary bulbs to the CFL bulbs, it was done through a complex incentive system using carbon credits, in the sense that in India, the distribution company would arrange that any company that actually wants to replace existing incandescent bulbs with the CFL bulbs would actually get so many carbon credits which it could sell. And as a result of that, quite a lot of expansion in households took place until the carbon market collapsed, because globally the whole focus on, you know, using carbon credit trading has gone down. And as a matter of fact, when this thing was introduced, the carbon credits were earning, I forget, about $10 to $12 or something. And since then, they've collapsed to $3. So this particular mechanism isn't actually working anymore. But, you know, it's just an illustration that a combination of price incentives and regulatory incentives can actually make a significant difference. Of course, linked to that, 10 more minutes, okay. Linked to that is the use of electricity for renewables. Lots of possibilities of buildings, again, commercial buildings, setting up solar rooftop electricity generating equipment. Once again, that would be linked to what the cost of electricity, but even more